In chess, there are different stages of the game. The first several moves are commonly referred to as openings. It is popular for people who practice chess to memorize a set of opening moves and stick to those moves with little regard to the moves of their opponent. Once a player has exhausted her memorized opening moves, she then moves on to what chess players call the middle game. Understanding the difference between opening strategies and middle game strategies in chess is a great way to understand the progression of speeches in debate. Your openings are the constructive speeches that you prepared before the round. There are certain arguments you know you are going to make, and you are going to make little to no modifications to those arguments. But once you make those arguments, you move into the stage of the debate where you need to have a different approach to strategy. You need to be able to answer the arguments of your opponent directly. And if your opponent constructed a well-developed disadvantage, then coming up with quick answers might be a bit intimidating. Fortunately, just like in chess, there are predictable patterns that allow competitors to develop quick and effective responses to their opponents. In this lesson, we will focus on common answers to disadvantages. Each stock issue in a disadvantage has common answers, so we will follow the structure of a disadvantage and explore the responses that debaters can make on the uniqueness level, link level, and impact level. We know that a disadvantage is more likely in a policy round than a value round, but you will see that these responses are applicable for all types of debate. Additionally, some of the examples used in this lesson might strike you as odd. We get it. But remember, these examples are simply illustrations of potential arguments. You ought to pick and choose which you think are the best and practice them. By now, you should understand the importance of establishing uniqueness for any disadvantage. An opponent can target your uniqueness and dismantle the entire disadvantage. Such a tactic is known as the non-unique response. There are essentially two ways to argue a disadvantage is non-unique: by saying the disadvantage is going to occur regardless of the advocacy, and by saying that if the disadvantage were true, that the impacts would have happened already. Let's consider a hypothetical example. The affirmative advocates investing in natural gas as an alternative energy source, with the advantage of reducing the dependence on foreign oil and lessening the chance for international war. The negative develops a complete disadvantage, which essentially argues that natural gas contributes to global warming, and they have some pretty good uniqueness evidence to support that claim. They also have some pretty well-researched impacts on global warming. This is a pretty intimidating scenario for the next affirmative speaker, but a response to the uniqueness for this disadvantage yields some unorthodox arguments. The first type of non-unique is to argue that the disadvantage will occur regardless of the plan. In this case, global warming is going to happen regardless of whether or not we invest in natural gas. For some debaters, this seems like a bad response because your plan does nothing to solve a major problem. But the logic is that global warming is neither a reason to vote for the plan nor against the plan. Global warming is something that is going to happen no matter what, but war for oil is preventable, so we should do the plan. The other type of non-unique is to say that the impact should have occurred already. If the argument is that natural gas is going to make global warming worse, then we should have seen a spike in greenhouse gases since the 1980s, when hydraulic fracturing, the newest way to extract natural gas, was first developed. But we don't see that spike. Just the same steady increase in greenhouse gases that was happening well before fracking. In short, there is reason to believe that there is no unique relation between global warming and natural gas. You might be unimpressed with either of these responses, and that is understandable. Non-unique is inherently defensive. You aren't scoring points, you are preventing your opponent from scoring points. Offense is flashier, but you should realize that if your opponent fails to address either of these arguments, they can't access their impacts. In other words, the disadvantage goes away. It has no bearing on the plan, which means, in the judge's eyes, the debate is no longer a choice between war for oil and global warming. The debate is only about whether or not we should do something to avoid war, and that is an easy decision for the affirmative. So non-unique alone is sufficient to defeat a disadvantage, but it isn't absolutely necessary. There are some devastating arguments that the affirmative can make in response to the link level of a disadvantage. The first, no link. This is simple. In debate, a link is the explanation of the causal relationship between your advocacy and some really bad impacts. It links your advocacy to those impacts. So a no-link argument simply dispels the causal relationship between the advocacy and the impacts. Another hypothetical. The affirmative advocates using electronic tablets for teaching. The negative argues a disadvantage which starts with noticing that tablets are made with rare earth minerals and ends with research about how lots of money in the rare earth minerals market funds some pretty horrible human rights abuses. The no-link response might be for the affirmative to point out that Apple recently announced that it checked its suppliers and can verify that none of the commodities come from these areas. So as long as the plan specifies Apple tablets, there's no link between tablets for students and conflict minerals. The no-link response works equally well for internal links. In fact, the previous example was actually a response to an internal link on a conflict minerals disadvantage. The next link-level response is the no-brink. This is a creative argument that essentially says that there is no definitive moment where the actions of the plan necessarily trigger the impacts. Some smokers use the no-brink response when told they should quit because they might get cancer. They say, "Yeah, but now is a bad time." If they were a debater, they might say, "No brink. While cigarettes increase the likelihood of contracting cancer, this one cigarette that I'm smoking is not enough to trigger that impact," which would be very confusing to the average person. But that is the essence. Yes, there are risks, but the plan is not enough to trigger the impacts. This argument is hard for some debaters to handle when arguing a global warming disadvantage. The no-brink response is that even if the plan generates greenhouse gases, it is not significant enough to affect global warming one way or the other. The final link-level response we will cover is called the turn. This is fundamentally different from all of the arguments we have gone over in this lesson so far, in that it is offense where everything else has been defense. What used to be called a turnaround in debate has been shortened to turn. It means that what at first seemed to be a reason for one side has now become a reason to vote for the other. Recall the global warming disadvantage from before? A link turn would be to explain that natural gas electrical power plants emit only half as much as coal-fired power plants. Therefore, more natural gas would, arguably, reduce greenhouse gas emissions. In short, what was a global warming disadvantage is now a global warming advantage, thereby creating two reasons to vote for the affirmative: avert war and reduce global warming. A lot of debate about disadvantages happen at the link level, but debaters should be aware of impact level responses as well because they can be powerful. There are two fundamental impact level responses: no impact and impact turn. No impact is the so what of argumentation. Basically, the argument is that even if the impact of the disadvantage occurs, it is not significant enough to vote against the advocacy. For a global warming argument, there are many significant impacts that a team can choose: rising sea levels, extreme weather, drought, famine, resource wars, etc. But there are also relatively insignificant impacts. Imagine that an opponent runs a global warming disadvantage and the only articulated impact is that global warming will shorten skiing seasons. This is a very real impact that might result from climate change. But if the case is about war for oil, then a shorter ski season comes nowhere near the level of significance for a judge to vote. The affirmative should say, there is no impact to a shortened ski season, which means, who cares if people ski less as a result of averting war? But debaters get creative with no impact arguments, using it in ways that real policy analysts never would. Think about this. How would you respond to the following argument about global warming leading to rising sea levels? There is no impact to rising sea levels because mainly rich people live on the beach and they can afford to move. This may sound ridiculous, and it is, but is still an argument that requires a response, and that response may suck up enough time from a debater to mess up their time allocation. And because it is a defensive argument, there is little risk for your opponent to successfully respond to it. The other impact level argument is the turn, and the concept is the same as the link level turn, but an impact term argues that the impact that the opposition declared to be bad is actually good. This is far less common than the link turn, but if done successfully can confound your opponents. For instance, If the impact of global warming is melting ice caps, the impact turn is that less ice would open up trade routes north of Canada and Russia, and that would be a massive boon for the world economy. There's even literature that exists that you can cite to support this argument. This unconventional argument is just one of the many global warming good arguments that have been written about. You may personally disagree with it, at least I hope you do, but it does pose an obstacle that your opponents must overcome if they want to win the disadvantage. Plus, because of its unconventionality, it might throw your opponents for a loop. In fact, impact turns typically confuse debaters because many of them never question their fundamental assumptions about what they think is good and bad. As you can see, there are general tactics for answering disadvantages that can be applied to any and all topics. It is helpful during prep time to go through this list of generic responses and test out responses for how they sound. You will not like them all, but the point is to generate enough responses for you to choose the best one, rather than feeling like you are only allowed to make one response to a disadvantage. Understanding uniqueness, link, and impact level responses is vital to having a successful middle game in debate. Because, after all, once the constructives are over, the debate is just beginning.